She was 30 years old, worth $3 billion, and she had just laughed in a maintenance worker's face. A quiet laugh. Not a polite, uncomfortable laugh. A real one, sharp and dismissive, right in front of her engineers, her investors, and a man who had done nothing except try to help. His name was Noah Callahan. He wore a grease-stained shirt and boots that had seen better years. And standing there, in that gleaming prototype bay, surrounded by people who had spent $700,000 looking for an answer he'd already found, he said nothing. He just walked away. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where ordinary people do extraordinary things. And trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go back to the beginning. The morning everything started going sideways, Noah Callahan was 45 minutes late picking up Maisie from school because he forgot, not because he was careless. He was late because the freight elevator on the third floor of the Halcyon Velocity facility had decided, for reasons that industrial equipment apparently doesn't feel the need to explain, to stop responding to its own control panel at 4:50 in the afternoon, and Noah was the only maintenance contractor on site who knew how to reach inside its relay housing without getting killed. He fixed it in 18 minutes, grabbed his jacket off the hook, near the loading, punched out on the timesheet with hands that still smelled faintly of machine oil, and drove 40 miles over the speed limit on a road where the speed limit was already too slow. Maisie was sitting on the front steps of Birchwood Elementary with her backpack between her knees and her chin resting on top of it when he pulled up. She was 6 years old. She had her mother's eyes wide and dark and impossible to lie to. She watched him jog across the pickup lane toward her with that expression she'd been perfecting since she was about 4, the one that said, "I'm not mad, I'm just going to remember this forever." "Traffic," Noah said. "You always say traffic. Traffic always happens." She stood up, adjusted her backpack straps with a seriousness that seemed excessive for a 6-year-old, and reached up for his hand. He took it. They walked back to the truck together without another word about it. It was Maisie. She didn't need a big apology. She just needed him to show up. He was always showing up. Noah had been a maintenance contractor for 9 years. Before that, he'd done 2 years at a community college studying mechanical engineering before money ran out and life accelerated in the way that life sometimes does for people who don't have a safety net waiting underneath them. Yes, he'd intervened. He'd learned most of what he knew by doing it, by crawling inside machines that other people had given up on, by listening to the particular language that broken equipment speaks right before it gives out completely. Vibrations, clicks, heat signatures, the specific way a motor hesitates before it quits. He'd gotten good at it, the way people get good at things when there's no other option. He and Maisie lived in a 2-bedroom house in Ranton, a town about 30 miles outside the city that had been slowly growing for the past decade and had not yet grown enough to become expensive. The house had a backyard with a leaning oak tree that Maisie had named Gerald. The kitchen faucet dripped unless you turned it off a specific way that Noah had explained to Maisie approximately 30 times. The carpet in the hallway was starting to separate at one edge. He didn't own the house. He rented it. He worked contract jobs at industrial and manufacturing sites across the region, which meant the money was sometimes steady and sometimes not, and he was always watching the gap between the two. He drove a 2011 pickup truck with 240,000 miles on it and a rattling sound in the rear differential that he'd been meaning to address for 6 months. He was raising his daughter alone. Her mother, Elena, had left when Maisie was 2, not dramatically, not with a fight, just quietly and then completely, the way some people exit things they were never fully inside of. Didn't talk about it much. Maisie didn't ask much. They had built something together, in that small house, just the two of them, and it worked. Was enough. The Halcyon Velocity contract had started 3 months earlier. It was a short-term maintenance agreement, general equipment upkeep across the facility's secondary buildings, loading areas, and operational infrastructure. The kind of work that never ended up in a press release. He showed up early, kept his head down, did what he was hired to do, and left without making himself memorable to anyone important. Was how these jobs worked. You were invisible unless something broke. He'd noticed the main prototype bay on his second week. You couldn't miss it. The Tempest R1 occupied the center of a space that had been designed to make it look important: high ceilings, climate-controlled air, lighting that seemed engineered specifically to make carbon fiber body panels look like they were made from something found in space. The car was genuinely extraordinary to look at. Low, angular, built with the kind of aggressive precision that suggested everyone involved had been told the word compromise was a firing offense. Didn't know much about luxury electric vehicles specifically, but he knew machines. And over the course of those first weeks, he'd watched the Tempest R1 die in a dramatic way, not with sparks or smoke or any of the visual drama that would have made for a good news clip. It just went quiet, mid-demonstration, mid-test run, mid-sentence from whatever engineer was standing nearby, explaining to whoever was watching why this was the most significant automotive technology development of the decade. The car simply powered down. Systems went dark, and then the room would fill with the very specific silence of people who had too much invested in something that had just stopped working, had watched it happen 3 times in the weeks before the investor demonstration. The first time, he assumed the engineers would figure it out quickly. The second time, he started paying closer attention. The third time, he caught something. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Was running electrical diagnostics on a freight panel in the loading corridor, about 60 feet from the prototype bay, close enough to see through the reinforced glass partition, far enough to be completely invisible to everyone inside it. The Tempest R1 had been running a low-speed systems test. Engineers were watching monitors. Someone was taking notes on a tablet. A woman in a charcoal blazer stood off to one side, with her arms crossed, watching. Had noticed her before. He'd asked one of the facility's regular maintenance staff who she was. That's Cassandra Wren, the guy had told him. She runs the whole company. She's the one who built this place from nothing. Noah had looked at her more carefully after that. She was younger than he'd expected, early 30s at most. He'd intervened. She carried herself with the particular tension of someone who had been performing competence for so long that it had stopped being performance. She had dark hair pulled back and a way of standing very still when she was worried about something. He recognized that, actually. He did the same thing. The car went quiet, same as before, and that's when Noah heard it. A faint clicking sound, 2, maybe 3 clicks in quick succession about a half second before the systems went dark. Underneath it, if you were listening for it, a very subtle vibration in the floor. From the car itself. From the equipment mounting beneath the rear power assembly. He set down his diagnostic tool. He stood very still and thought about it. He'd spent 9 years listening to machines. He'd heard that specific combination before the click, then the vibe, then the shutdown in industrial equipment. Large manufacturing presses, mostly. Temperature-sensitive relay switches that lost contact when heat buildup reached a certain threshold. They were a common failure point in older equipment. Less common in something this advanced, this new, this expensive. But Heat didn't care about price tags. He knew what it was. It was almost completely certain. He went back to work on the freight panel. The investor demonstration was scheduled for a Friday. Found out about it, the way he found out about most things at the facility, through secondhand conversation near the break room coffee machine. A group of engineers were talking about it with a kind of controlled anxiety that told him this one mattered more than the previous tests. High-profile investors, board members, media presence. The kind of audience for whom a failed demonstration wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially existential. He thought about it for 2 days. On Thursday morning, he made a decision that he would later describe to his daughter, when she was old enough to understand it, as probably stupid, but the kind of stupid you'd regret not doing. He didn't go to anyone junior. He didn't leave a note. Yes, he intervened. He asked one of the administrative staff near the prototype bay if there was any cease to speak briefly with someone from the engineering team before the following day's demonstration. He was told to wait. He waited 40 minutes. A man named Derek Holt came out, one of the local engineers, mid-40s, with the permanent expression of someone who had not slept at the right times for many years. He looked at Noah with the automatic dismissiveness of someone who had already categorized him before he spoke. The maintenance contractor? Yes, sir. Noah Callahan. What is it? Noah kept it simple. He described what he'd heard: the clicking, the sequence, the vibration pattern. He described the thermal relay theory. He explained that in industrial equipment, a heat-sensitive relay losing contact during sustained operation could cause exactly the kind of intermittent shutdown they were experiencing. He said it had happened to him before in manufacturing environments. He said a replacement relay in the right specification would probably cost around $12. Derek listened with the expression of a man who was being patient purely out of professional obligation. When Noah finished, Derek nodded. Once the nod, that means I have heard you, and we are done here, thanked him, and went back inside, returned to his freight panel. He didn't hear back from anyone. The Friday demonstration started at 10 in the morning. Was supposed to be working in the secondary equipment building on the far side of the facility. But the truth was, and he would admit this later, to himself, in the way you admit things you'd rather not, he stayed close. He had a legitimate reason to be in the loading corridor that morning. The freight elevator on the second floor needed a follow-up check. That part was true. The rest of it was that he wanted to see what happened. He could see the prototype bay from the corridor window. The Tempest R1 sat at the center of the room, flanked by halcyon velocity engineers and what looked like a dozen people in expensive suits. Cassandra Wren was there, standing slightly forward from the group, talking with animation and precision in the way that people do when they've rehearsed what they're going to say, but are trying hard to make it sound unrehearsed. The car powered up. The initial run looked smooth. Watched it from the window with his arms folded. The system's display lit up. The engineers were nodding. The investors leaned in. 43 minutes into the demonstration, the Tempest R1 went quiet. Same as before. He watched Cassandra's posture change that half second before the professional mask goes back on, where you can see what someone actually feels. She turned to Derek. Derek turned to his tablet. The investor group exchanged glances, set down his clipboard, and decided to do the second stupid thing in 2 days. He found a facility staff member near the bay entrance and asked if he could speak with Ms. Wren for 2 minutes. The staff member looked at him with frank skepticism, said it was about the shutdown. The staff member went inside. Cassandra Wren came to the corridor doorway herself. She was still composed, but there was a tightness around her eyes that told him she was burning through her composure at a rate she could not afford. She looked at his work shirt, the Callahan Maintenance Services logo on the chest, his worn boots, his hands. You asked to speak with me? Yes, ma'am. My name's Noah Callahan. I do maintenance contracting here. I think I know what's wrong with the car. Something passed across her face. Not quite curiosity. Like the polite attention, more like the polite attention you give someone before you redirect them to someone else. Our engineering team is... I talked to Derek Holt yesterday, Noah said. I understand if it didn't seem worth following up on. I just wanted to say it once more, directly before the demonstration ends. She studied him for a moment. Go ahead. It's a thermal relay. Heat sensitive. Your assembly reaches a certain operating temperature, probably around 45 to 50 minutes, and the relay loses contact, and the system shuts down as a safety response. It would explain why the shutdowns are intermittent and why they don't produce error codes consistent with a software or primary electrical failure. The relay's probably in a mounting position that puts it close to a heat source it wasn't originally designed to sit next to. He paused. Replacement part runs about $12. Takes maybe 20 minutes to install if you know where to look. Cassandra Wren stared at him. Then she laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh exactly. It wasn't calculated. It was genuine, the laugh of someone confronted with something that seemed so absurd that laughter was the only immediate response available. But it was loud enough. And in a corridor adjacent to an open prototype bay, with a dozen engineers and investors inside it, loud enough meant everyone heard it. A couple of engineers appeared in the doorway behind her. One of them, a younger man Noah didn't know by name, smirked. $12, Cassandra said, still with that smile that hadn't decided yet whether to be apologetic or amused. We have been working on this vehicle for 6 months. We have aerospace engineers. We have 3 separate diagnostic systems. She stopped herself, seemed to rein something in. I appreciate you raising it. I really do. But I think we'll continue with the engineering team. Of course. Noah said. He picked up his clipboard and walked back toward the freight elevator. He did not slam a door. He did not say anything under his breath. He went up to the second floor, checked the elevator mechanism, made 2 notes on his clipboard, and clocked out at noon. On the drive to pick up Maisie, he turned the radio up and didn't think about it. That was what he told himself. Anyway, Maisie had art class on Fridays, and she always came out of school with something. That afternoon, it was a painting orange and blue, abstract in the way that 6-year-old art is abstract, which is to say completely earnest and free of any self-consciousness about whether it was good. That's Gerald, she said, pointing to a brown vertical smear on the left side. Tree. He's happy today. Why is Gerald happy today? She thought about it seriously. Because it's Friday. Looked at the painting. Gerald has good judgment. She climbed into the truck and buckled herself in. She'd been doing it herself for almost a year and considered any offer of help an insult, and they drove home. Made pasta. Maisie sat at the kitchen table and did the worksheet her teacher had sent home about telling time, which she found deeply boring, and said so repeatedly. I already know what time it is, she said. What time is it? Time to be done with this worksheet. He laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed since noon. Later, after Maisie was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he'd let go cold and thought about what had happened. With self-pity. Exactly more. With the quiet frustration of someone who had been certain of something and been dismissed before they could demonstrate the certainty. He'd been dismissed before. It happened in this work. People with degrees looked at people without degrees, the way Cassandra Wren had looked at him, not always with cruelty. Sometimes with something closer to reflexive disbelief. The idea that a maintenance contractor might know something an aerospace engineer didn't was simply too counterintuitive to take seriously in the moment. He understood that. He didn't like it, but he understood it. What stayed with him longer than the laugh itself was the quiet of the corridor after it. The way the younger engineer had smirked. The way Derek Holt's name had meant nothing as a reference. The way his work shirt had functioned as a complete sentence before he'd opened his mouth. He finished the cold coffee and went to bed. The relay would do what relays did. Over the next several weeks, Noah watched Halcyon Velocity's response to the Tempest R1 problem escalate with the particular logic of institutions that cannot accept simple answers. He watched it from the loading corridor, from the break room, from the secondary equipment building. He was not looking for it, exactly. But when you work inside a facility every day, information moves the way water moves, finding its way through any gap, pooling wherever people are standing around waiting for something. The company brought in a software specialist from a consultancy in Boston. A second one. The prototype bay became a revolving door of people in expensive clothes carrying laptops, running diagnostics, writing reports. Overheard someone say the word firmware 17 times in a single conversation near the coffee machine. He overheard someone else say they were considering a complete redesign of the thermal management system. The thermal management system that was not, as far as Noah could tell, the actual problem. He said nothing. He repaired a malfunctioning hydraulic press in the secondary building. He replaced corroded wiring in the east freight corridor. He identified a failing bearing in the HVAC system 3 weeks before it would have failed on its own. He did his job. He picked up Maisie every afternoon. He made dinner. He helped with homework. He read to her. On the nights she couldn't sleep, she was going through a phase of asking for the same 3 books on repeat, and he had memorized them to a degree that felt slightly alarming. He went to her parent conference and listened to her peer teacher, Pietrich, describe Maisie as curious and persistent, and occasionally a little too interested in telling other students what to do, which he received as a compliment, even though he suspected it wasn't entirely meant as one. He was building his life around those ordinary things. And somewhere inside Halcyon Velocity's gleaming prototype bay, the Tempest R1 kept shutting down. It was a Thursday evening late when Noah was finishing up the last item on his work log, a junction box inspection on the north wall of the primary facility, that he heard raised voices from the direction of the prototype bay. Argument voices. Stress voices. The kind that happen when people are frightened about something and are trying to sound controlled about it. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The corridor acoustics carried the sound. What he heard was enough. Another failed test run. Investor meeting, gone wrong. Board pressure. A timeline that had already slipped twice was slipping again. The words catastrophic liability appeared in someone's sentence and sat there like a stone. Finished his junction box inspection. He drove home. He made sure Maisie's lunch was packed for the next day, and her school shoes were by the door where she could find them without needing to ask him. He turned off the kitchen light. He thought about $12. He thought about what that laughter had felt like in the corridor, not devastating, exactly, but specific in the way that certain memories are specific, the kind you can still feel in your chest months later. He thought about Derek Holt's face, politely waiting for him to finish. He thought about the engineer in the doorway with the smirk. He'd intervened. He thought about Maisie's question from a few weeks back, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, when he told her, in the simplified terms he used for stories about his workday, he tried to tell someone something useful, and they hadn't wanted to hear it. She had looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "Did it make you mad?" A little, he'd said honestly. "Are you going to stay mad?" He'd thought about it. No. Why not? Because being right doesn't mean you get to be mean about it. She'd considered this for a long moment. Then she'd returned to her cereal. He'd meant it when he said it. He still meant it now. The relay would do what relays did. Eventually, someone would find it. They always found it. Eventually, it just sometimes cost more than it should have. He turned off the bedroom light. Outside the oak tree Maisie had named Gerald shifted in a late autumn wind. And $700,000 away, in a research center full of brilliant, expensive, exhausted people, a $12 component sat in exactly the wrong position, waiting patiently for someone to finally ask the right question. The Monday after the last failed test, Cassandra Wren arrived at Halcyon Velocity at 6:47 in the morning, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes before going inside. She did not do things like that. She was not someone who sat in parking garages. She had built this company on the principle that momentum was the only thing standing between ambition and collapse, and momentum required movement, and movement required getting out of the car. But that morning she sat there with her hands resting on the steering wheel of a vehicle that cost more than most people's houses, staring at the concrete wall in front of her, and she tried to figure out how she was going to walk back into that building and face another day as facing the same problem she had been facing for 6 months. The Tempest R1 had failed again on Friday afternoon. A closed test, no investors this time, just her core engineering team and Marcus Webb, the head of her board of directors, who had driven 2 hours specifically to watch it. Marcus was 61 years old and had the particular gift of being able to communicate profound disappointment using only the angle of his jaw. He had said very little on Friday. He hadn't needed to. She got out of the car. Inside, the facility was already running. That was the thing about having a staff this large. The machine kept moving, regardless of whether the person at the top of it had spent 11 minutes in a parking garage, losing a quiet argument with herself. Engineers were at their stations. The administrative team was already fielding morning correspondence. Someone had brought donuts and left them near the break room, and there was something almost unbearably normal about a box of donuts sitting 20 feet from a prototype that was costing the company its future. Her assistant, a sharp 28-year-old named Priya, who had the organizational instincts of someone twice her age, appeared at her side with a tablet and a coffee she hadn't asked for but needed. "Board call at 9, Priya said. "Marcus wants a preliminary damage assessment on the timeline before then. Derek submitted his report last night. I flagged it at the top of your queue." "How bad?" Priya's pause was its own answer. "That bad," Cassandra said. "He's recommending a full redesign of the secondary thermal management architecture. Estimated timeline is 14 to 18 weeks. Budget request is..." Priya glanced at the tablet. "Significant." Cassandra took the coffee. "Send me the report. Push the board call to 10. I need an hour before I talk to Marcus." She went to her office, closed the door, and read Derek's report twice. The second read was worse than the first. 14 to 18 weeks meant the Tempest R1 launch window, the one they had already pushed back twice, was effectively gone. Gone meant the investor commitments that were contingent on the launch timeline were in jeopardy. Gone meant the press coverage they had carefully cultivated over 18 months, the anticipation they had built, in the automotive media pre-order list that currently sat at 412 vehicles, all of it sitting in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for a car that kept going quiet in a room full of people watching it. She pulled up the budget summary. Since the problem began, Halcyon Velocity had spent approximately $480,000 on diagnostic consultants, software specialists, additional engineering contracts, and equipment. Derek's new proposal would add another $220,000 minimum. That brought the total to somewhere north of $700,000, and none of it had produced an answer. She closed the report. She looked at the wall across from her desk, which had a framed photograph of the Tempest R1 taken at the original concept reveal, 18 months ago, all promise, all potential, every surface suggesting a future that had seemed, at the time, entirely achievable. It was the most expensive photograph she owned. She thought about Friday, about Marcus and the angle of his jaw, about the way the room had gone quiet when the car went dark again, that specific silence that had its own texture by now, its own particular weight. She knew it the way you know the sound of a door closing in an empty house. And then, from somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard a voice say, "A thermal relay." She pushed it away. She picked up her phone and called Derek. He answered on the second ring. "Morning. You read the report?" "I read it. Walk me through the thermal management redesign. Why are we doing a full architectural overhaul instead of identifying the specific failure point?" "Because we've run every diagnostic we have on every specific component, and we cannot isolate a failure point. The shutdowns aren't producing consistent error signatures. We've checked every relay, every junction, every relay. Every relay in the primary and secondary systems, yes. 3 times. She almost said it then. She was close enough that she could feel the words forming. But there was something in the way Derek said every relay, the professional certainty of it, the tone that meant this has been handled, this territory is covered. Please don't question my process, that made her pull back. "Fine," she said. "Get me a revised proposal with a Phase 1 cost breakdown before the board call." She hung up. She went back to the framed photograph on the wall. The relay said the back of her mind, quietly and without apology. She poured the coffee down the office sink and went to get a fresh one. The board call at 10 lasted 90 minutes, which was 60 minutes longer than board calls were supposed to last, and 30 minutes shorter than it felt. Marcus led most of it. He had a way of structuring difficult conversations that made them feel like autopsies, methodical, thorough, and conducted with a particular detachment of someone who had already moved past grief into documentation. He walked through the timeline of failures. He walked through the budget expenditure. He walked through the revised projections from Derek's report. He did not raise his voice once. "The question we need to answer," Marcus said, "is whether we're dealing with a solvable engineering problem or a fundamental design flaw, because those two things require very different responses." "It's solvable," Cassandra said. "You've been saying that for 6 months. I'm still saying it." A beat of silence. On the video call, she could see the faces of 6 board members in their individual squares, some neutral, some carefully attentive, 1 or 2 wearing the expression of people doing math they hadn't finished yet. "The market window is closing," said a board member named Elaine Forsyth, who ran 3 other investment portfolios and had a gift for stating obvious things in a way that made them sound newly discovered. "If we miss the spring launch, we're competing against 2 other hypercars that are already in final production. We lose first mover advantage. I know that, Elaine. The pre-order list won't hold indefinitely. We've already had 9 cancellations in the last 3 weeks." "I know that too. Then what is your plan, Cassandra?" Marcus asked, unkindly. That was the thing about Marcus, he could ask the hardest question in the room without making it sound like an attack, which somehow made it worse. She told them about Derek's proposal, the thermal management redesign, the 14 to 18-week timeline, the additional budget. She laid it out cleanly and professionally, and she watched their faces while she did it, and she could see them calculating, not just costs, but confidence. Confidence in her. Confidence in the company. The thing that $700,000 and 6 months of failure quietly eroded, not all at once, but in steady, consistent increments the way water erodes stone. When she finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Approved," he said. "Conditionally. I want monthly updates, and I want a hard deadline. If we're not seeing results by the end of Q1, we need to have a different conversation." She knew what the different conversation looked like. "Understood, Kut," she said. The call ended. She sat in her office for a while after the screen went dark. Derek's team began the thermal management redesign that week. The prototype bay became even more densely populated than it had been. Additional engineers brought in from outside contractors, specialists in thermal dynamics, who arrived with their own equipment and their own opinions, which occasionally conflicted with the opinions of the specialists already there. There were long conversations that Noah, passing through the corridor on his own work assignments, could hear fragments of without being able to assemble into a coherent picture, that he was trying. He had made a decision sometime in those weeks after the Friday demonstration, not a dramatic decision, not a thing he sat down and consciously chose, more like the way water makes a decision when it finds the lowest path available. He was going to do his job. He was going to do it well. He'd intervened. He was going to pick up Maisie at 3:30 every afternoon and make dinner and help with homework and read the same 3 books she cycled through until he could recite them backward. And he was going to let the Tempest R1 be someone else's problem. He had tried. He had been clear. He had been dismissed, was the whole story as far as it concerned him. Except that December came, and with it a cold snap that dropped temperatures in the facility's older equipment zones, below what the HVAC system had been calibrated to handle. Yes, intervened, and Noah spent 3 weeks doing cold weather maintenance work that kept him closer to the main facility building than his usual assignments, which meant he was unavoidably more aware of what was happening in the prototype bay. What was happening was not good. He picked it up through fragments overheard conversations, the body language of engineers passing through the break room, the way the administrative staff answered phones with a particular careful neutrality that meant the person on the other end was someone important and unhappy. The thermal management redesign was not solving the problem. The Tempest R1 was still shutting down. He heard this specifically and clearly on a Wednesday afternoon when he was replacing a damaged ceiling panel in the hallway adjacent to the engineering briefing room. The panel replacement was a legitimate, scheduled task. The wall between the corridor and the briefing room was not particularly well insulated for sound. He was not eavesdropping. He was also not leaving. Inside the room, Derek Holt was briefing what sounded like 3 or 4 engineers, his voice carrying the flat exhaustion of someone who had been managing a crisis for so long that the crisis had started to feel like his natural habitat. The redesigned thermal management system performed within spec on tests 1 through 4, Derek said. Test 5 shut down, same profile as before, no consistent error signature. A voice Noah didn't recognize said, "Did the timing change at all?" "Marginally. We're seeing shutdowns at 40 to 48 minutes now versus 43 to 52 before. We've changed something. We just haven't changed the right thing." Voice, "Could it still be software?" "We've had 2 independent software audits. Both came back clean. So what are we looking at?" Long pause. "I don't know," Derek said. And the flatness in those 3 words was the flatness of a man who had not said them in a professional context in a very long time and was finding the experience genuinely unpleasant. Finished replacing the ceiling panel. He gathered his tools and walked back down the corridor toward the equipment storage room. He put his tools away. He washed his hands at the utility sink. He looked at his reflection in the scratched metal surface above the sink, not a mirror exactly, more like a suggestion of one. A thermal relay, heat sensitive, 40 to 48 minutes. He thought about Maisie's question. Did it make you mad? He thought. A little, still. He dried his hands. He went back to work. The weeks around the holidays were quieter at the facility. Staffing reduced, the pace slowed. The particular tension that had been running through the prototype bay since October dropped from a constant hum to something closer to a low murmur. Engineers took time off. Consultants went back to wherever consultants went when they weren't being paid $700 an hour to not solve problems. Worked through most of it. Contract maintenance didn't take holidays in the way salaried positions did. If equipment needed attention, it needed attention, and that was true on December 23rd, the same as it was true any other day. Maisie spent the school break with Noah's sister, Renata, who lived 40 minutes north in a house that was significantly warmer and louder than theirs, with 3 kids of her own and a husband who made large amounts of food for no reason Noah had ever been able to determine. Maisie loved it there. She came back from those visits overstimulated and full of opinions and talking faster than usual, and it always took her 2 or 3 days to wind back down to her normal register. Aunt Renata says, "You should get out more," Maisie informed him on the drive home from Renata's. "Does she?" She says, "You work too much and you don't talk to people enough." "I talk to people." She means different people. Noah glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window with an expression of studied neutrality that was almost certainly inherited from him, which he found uncomfortable to acknowledge. "Tell Aunt Renata I'm fine. She'll say you always say that. She's not wrong." Maisie seemed to consider whether to press further, then apparently decided against it and went back to the window. She had a gift for knowing when she'd made her point. Drove the rest of the way home thinking about what fine actually meant, practically speaking. It meant functional. It meant managed. It meant he'd built a life that ran without crashing, that kept Maisie fed and warm and at school on time and loved unambiguously, consistently loved, and that was not nothing. Was in fact the main thing. He wasn't unhappy. He was just tired in a way that sleep didn't fully address, and he was doing a thing that a lot of people who are 32 and raising a child alone do, which is mistake sustainability for contentment. He didn't examine that too closely. There was a ceiling panel in the east corridor that needed replacing on the 27th, and Maisie's school supply list for the new semester had 7 items on it. And the rear differential in the truck was getting louder in a way that could no longer be diplomatically described as a minor concern. He had enough to think about. January came. The facility returned to full operational capacity. The prototype bay lit up again. Derek's team added 2 new consultants. Noah heard one of them described near the coffee machine as an expert in electromagnetic interference, which suggested the investigation had taken yet another turn away from anything Noah recognized as relevant to the actual problem. He watched when he could see it without going out of his way, the slow daily rhythm of people who were working very hard in the wrong direction. He recognized it because he'd seen it before in equipment rooms where the problem had been misdiagnosed and everyone was chasing a ghost while the real failure sat 2 feet away being patient. It was something almost painful about watching it from the outside, knowing what he knew, having already said what he'd said, so he didn't say it again. What would be the point? He was a maintenance contractor with a grease-stained work shirt. He had already tried. The answer to trying again was the same corridor, the same face, the same laugh. He thought about it once at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep, really thought about it. The way you think about things at 3 in the morning when there's no noise to hide behind. He thought about whether staying quiet made him the bigger person or just the more convenient one. He thought about the $700,000. He thought about the engineers who weren't sleeping either, probably. The people who were genuinely trying to fix something they couldn't find. He thought about whether his silence was dignity or stubbornness, and whether there was actually a meaningful difference. He got up and drank a glass of water. He went back to bed. He picked up Maisie the next afternoon, and she'd had a good day, and she told him about it in the detailed, nonlinear way that 6-year-olds narrate their own days, jumping between lunch and recess, and something Tyler said, and a new book the teacher had introduced. And by the time they got home, he had stopped thinking about the relay entirely. Almost entirely. Cassandra Wren's office was on the 4th floor of the main building, and it had a window that overlooked the facility's central courtyard. In good weather, the courtyard was where staff took lunches and made phone calls. In January, it was mostly empty, bare pavement, a few benches, a single tree that had dropped everything it had to drop, and was now just a structure waiting for spring to tell it what to do next. She had been spending more time at that window than was strictly productive. The board call in January had been shorter than December's, which was not encouraging. Marcus had moved through the agenda with a brisk efficiency that told her he'd already started thinking past the Tempest R1 to whatever came after it. That was how Marcus operated, not in crisis mode, but in contingency mode, always already building the next position, while the current one was still being contested. It was a quality she'd admired in him for years. Right now, she found it deeply unsettling. Derek's team had spent an additional $60,000 in January and had not produced a definitive answer. The total, as of the third week of January, was just over $720,000. She kept coming back to that number. Not because of what it represented to the company's budget, the company could absorb it, barely, without catastrophic structural damage. Because of what it represented as a measurement of failure. $720,000 was what happened when you spent 6 months absolutely certain you were looking in the right places. On a Thursday night in the third week of January, she stayed in the office until 10 o'clock going through research files and diagnostic reports, looking for something she couldn't name, some thread she'd missed, some reading that didn't match the consensus, some note filed by someone at the margins of the investigations that hadn't received the weight it deserved. The files were organized chronologically, and she was moving through them backward, newest to oldest. She found the note in a folder dated October 23rd. This intervened. It was a single page, formatted inconsistently, not the template the engineering team used for internal communications, just a plain document that had been transcribed by someone on the administrative staff and filed without particular prominence. The header said, "Verbal report from facility maintenance contractor, Noah Callahan." She read it. She read it again. Possible thermal relay failure. Heat-sensitive relay losing contact at sustained operating temperature, approximately 45-50-minute mark. Failure consistent with observed shutdown profile. Consistent error code expected. Component replacement estimated at 12. She sat very still. She looked at the date. October 23rd, 2 days before the investor demonstration. 3 months ago. She thought about the corridor outside the prototype bay. She thought about a man in a maintenance shirt, direct and brief and completely untheatrical, saying something she had processed in real time as absurd. She thought about the laugh, her laugh, in front of her engineers and her investors, at a man who had come to her voluntarily with information he thought might help. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. The building was quiet around her. Maintenance had come through an hour ago and moved on. Somewhere on a lower floor, a ventilation system cycled. The courtyard outside her window was dark except for 2 small lights near the entrance that ran all night. She put the note on the desk in front of her where she could see it, and she sat with it for a long time. $720,000. $12. She didn't go home that night until after 11. She drove carefully on roads that were light with January traffic, through neighborhoods that were dark, and settled into sleep, past the all-night diner on Route 9 that she had never once stopped at, past the turn that led toward Ranford, and the parts of the region that didn't look like the parts she usually moved through. She thought about what kind of person laughs at someone who is trying to help. She thought about the answer and didn't like it. In the morning, she was going to have to walk into the prototype bay and look at the car that had cost her company everything she had poured into it, and she was going to have to decide what honesty required of her. She did not sleep particularly well, neither in a 2-bedroom house 30 miles away, with a daughter who had kicked her blankets off again, and a rear differential getting louder in a truck parked outside, did Noah Callahan. She came in at 6:30 the next morning, which was earlier than usual even for her, and she went directly to the prototype bay without stopping at her office first. The overnight security guard, a heavy-set man named Roy, who had worked the night shift at Halcyon Velocity for 4 years, and had seen Cassandra Wren at odd hours often enough to stop being surprised by it, gave her a nod as she badged through. She nodded back. The bay was empty. At this hour, the engineering team didn't typically arrive until 8, and the overnight monitoring systems ran automatically. She walked to the center of the room to the Tempest R1 and stood next to it the way you stand. Next to something you've put everything into. The car looked perfect. That was the maddening thing. It always looked perfect. There was nothing in its appearance, nothing in the clean lines, the carbon fiber body, or the precision-fitted panels that suggested anything was wrong with it. It looked like exactly what it was supposed to be, a masterpiece of engineering ambition, the kind of thing that changed what people thought was possible. It just wouldn't stay on. She walked slowly around the car, trailing her fingers along the body without quite touching it, and she tried to see it differently. Tried to look at it the way someone would look at it, who hadn't spent 18 months building it, who hadn't bet the company's future on it, who didn't have 6 months of failed reports and board calls and investor phone calls tangled up in every angle of it. She stopped at the rear. The rear power assembly housing was a smooth, sealed panel, accessible through a maintenance port on the underside. She crouched down and looked at it, without opening anything, without touching anything. She was not an electrical engineer. She could read schematics well enough to follow a conversation, but she couldn't look at a sealed housing and diagnose what was inside it. Wasn't the point of being here. The point of being here was to stand next thing for a few minutes without anyone watching and admit to herself what she'd spent most of the night not admitting. A maintenance contractor with 9 years of field experience had told her exactly what was wrong with this car 3 months ago, and she had laughed at him. $720,000 later, the problem was still unresolved, and the October 23rd note was sitting on her desk where she'd left it, and she had 2 choices. She could tell Derek to test the relay, or she could keep pretending she'd arrived at that conclusion independently, quietly order the test without attributing it, and let the correction happen without anyone having to acknowledge what the correction actually meant. She stood up. She thought about the kind of company she'd told herself she was building, the kind of leader she'd told herself she was. The gap between those things and what had actually happened in this room 3 months ago was not comfortable to measure. Went to her office and called Derek at 7:15. He answered with the slightly groggy quality of someone who had been awake for a while, but not yet fully functional. "I need you in the bay at 8, she said. "Your whole team." "'Kay. What are we doing?" She took a breath. "We're testing a relay." A pause. "Which relay?" "I'll explain when you get here." Derek arrived at 5 minutes to 8, with 3 of named Cassandra Chen, who specialized in thermal systems. A younger man named Pete Garza, who'd been on the Tempest R1 project since the beginning, and a consultant named Bryce who'd arrived in January and whose last name nobody seemed to use. They came in with their tablets and their coffee, and the look of people who had learned to approach every new morning at the facility as a fresh exercise in managed expectations. Cassandra was already in the bay. She had the October 23rd note in her hand, printed out. She did not give a long preamble. She had decided somewhere around 2 in the morning that a long preamble was the coward's version of this conversation. 3 months ago, she said, a maintenance contractor who works in this facility approached me outside this bay and described a failure theory. I dismissed it. I want you to read it and tell me whether it's worth testing. She handed the note to Derek. He read it. His face did a complicated thing, a series of small adjustments that she was watching closely, because she wanted to know exactly what those adjustments meant. Sandra Chen looked over his shoulder, read it, and said nothing. Pete Garza looked at the date on the paper, and then at Cassandra. October 23rd? Yes, that's before the investor demonstration. She said again, I know. The room was quiet for a moment. Derek handed the note to Bryce, who read it with the detached interest of someone encountering a problem fresh. The relay specification he's describing, Bryce said slowly, would be in the secondary mounting array, near the rear thermal boundary. He looked at Sandra. Have we run a contact resistance test on that array under sustained load? Sandra's expression shifted. We ran a baseline resistance test, under sustained thermal load. Why not? Because the initial diagnostic flagged the primary array as the high probability failure zone. We prioritized there. Bryce looked at the note again. If this relay is positioned where I think it's positioned, it's sitting within about 8 centimeters of the secondary heat sink. When the assembly runs long enough to bring that sink up to full operating temperature, it loses contact, Derek said. Not a question. It would explain why we can't get a consistent error code, Sandra said, and her voice had that particular quality of someone doing rapid, uncomfortable math. If the relay is losing contact intermittently, rather than failing completely, the system reads it as a transient rather than a fault event. It logs it and moves on, until the transient becomes a shutdown trigger. Which it does, Pete said, every time. 40 to 50 minutes in. The bay was very quiet. Derek set the note down on the workbench beside him. He had the look of a man absorbing something he needed a moment with. "Why didn't we catch this?" he said. Not to anyone specifically, just out loud. "Because we were looking at the primary array," Sandra said. "We ran full diagnostics on the systems we thought were high probability. The secondary mounting array was..." She stopped. It was in the background. It wasn't flagged. Derek looked at Cassandra. She could see him working through the same uncomfortable calculation she'd been working through since 11 o'clock the previous night. "You dismissed it when he told you, and I dismissed it the day before. When he came to me directly." "I know." Another silence. "All right," Derek said. He picked up the note, set it back down again, seemed to decide he didn't need to be holding it. "Let's test it." The test prep took most of the morning. Sandra pulled the schematics for the secondary mounting array. Bryce ran a preliminary contact resistance analysis on the relay assembly, in question a component that was, as he had suspected, positioned within an uncomfortably close range of the secondary heat sink. The relay itself looked fine at room temperature. Contacts clean, resistance within spec, no visible degradation. "It's going to look fine until it's hot," Bryce said. "How long to reach critical operating temperature at the heat sink?" Sandra asked. "Under full load, 40 minutes, maybe 45. He said anything about the shutdown timing?" They didn't need to. Pete Garza went to the parts inventory and looked up the relay specification Noah had described in the note. He came back 10 minutes later with an expression that was hard to read.
"Ma'am."
"We have it," he said. "In inventory?" Derek asked. "Standard maintenance parts. We've had it the whole time." Pete set it on the workbench. It was small, smaller than Cassandra had expected somehow, smaller than something should be when you had spent this long looking for it. "Retail cost on these is $11.95. Nobody touched it for a moment. Bryce picked it up, examined it briefly, and set it back down. "Let's get it installed and run the test." The installation took 22 minutes. Sandra did the work herself, carefully, with the focus of someone who understood that precision mattered here, not just technically, but symbolically. Cassandra stood back and watched. She didn't pace. She wasn't going to pace in front of her engineers. She stood at the edge of the workbench with her arms at her sides, and she watched Sandra's hands move with practiced certainty through the maintenance port of the rear assembly. "Done," Sandra said. She closed the maintenance port. They looked at the car. "Run it," Cassandra said. The Tempest R1 powered up at 11:47 in the morning. The startup sequence was the same, as it always was, the soft electronic tone, the system's display coming to life, the subtle vibration of a powertrain activating. Everything that happened in the first 5 minutes of a test run had always worked. The problem had never been the beginning. They ran the standard low-load test protocol. Cassandra sat in a chair someone had brought in from the side of the room, which she had not asked for, but sat in without comment. Because standing for an hour with her arms at her sides was its own kind of performance, and she was done performing things. 15 minutes, everything normal. Derek was watching the thermal monitoring display on his tablet, saying nothing. 20 minutes. 30. At 35 minutes, Sandra quietly said, "Secondary heatsink is approaching operating range." Pete Garza clicked his pen twice, the way he apparently did when he was nervous, and then caught himself and put the pen in his pocket. 40 minutes. The car was still on. Cassandra was watching the system's display. She'd watched it go dark so many times in this room that she half expected it, out of habit, the way you brace for a noise that has happened enough times in a particular place that your body starts anticipating it. Her hands were flat on her knees. She was being very still. 45 minutes. The car was still on. "Contact resistance is holding," Bryce said. He said it quietly, like he wasn't sure yet whether he was allowed to be relieved. 50 minutes. Sandra exhaled slowly through her nose. Was not a loud sound, but in the quiet of the bay, everyone heard it. 55 minutes. 1 hour. Derek looked up from his tablet. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the car, at the Tempest R1 sitting in the center of the bay, fully powered, all systems running, doing the thing it had been built to do, the thing it had been failing to do for 6 months, and he said quietly, "It's holding." Cassandra did not stand up immediately. She sat for another few seconds, looking at the display, making sure she was reading what she thought she was reading. Then she stood up. 1 hour and 12 minutes into the test, Sandra started the performance protocol, the sequence of increasing electrical loads that simulated real driving conditions. The systems responded. The power delivery was clean. The thermal readings were exactly where they were supposed to be. At 1 hour and 40 minutes, Pete Garza made a sound that was almost a laugh, but stopped itself before it got there. He turned toward the wall, like he was looking at something specific on it, which he was not. Bryce wrote something on his notepad. Derek set his tablet on the workbench and looked at Cassandra. "It's working," he said. 2 words. Flat and direct. But underneath them, or maybe just in the space around them, something that had been wound very tight for 6 months was beginning, slightly, to release. Cassandra looked at the car. Then she looked at the $12 relay, sitting on the workbench beside the notes and the schematics and the 3 months of everything else. "Clear the room," she said. Derek looked at her. "I don't mean that dramatically," she said. "I mean I need everyone to take a break. Go get lunch. Come back in an hour," she paused. "Please." They went. She stayed. She sat alone in the prototype bay for the better part of an hour, while the Tempest R1 ran clean and steady in front of her. It was not a comfortable hour. It was necessary, which was not the same thing. She had found in her life that the most necessary hours were frequently the least comfortable ones, and that the instinct to skip them was always strongest exactly when skipping them was most expensive. She thought about October 23rd. She thought about the corridor, the laugh, the way Noah Callahan had looked at her without anger or performance, just that flat, direct quality he had, like someone who had decided a long time ago that making a scene was not worth the energy it cost. He had simply picked up his clipboard and walked away, and she had turned back into the prototype bay to manage her crisis with the confidence of someone who had no idea that the crisis had just offered to introduce itself and been sent away. She thought about what she actually knew about Noah Callahan, which was almost nothing. A name on a contractor badge, a maintenance shirt, worn boots, a theory about a relay that she had laughed at in front of witnesses. She thought about the $720,000. She tried to make it feel abstract, the way large numbers sometimes become abstract when you deal with them professionally, figures on a spreadsheet, budget lines, quarterly adjustments. It didn't work. It sat in front of her as a very specific number attached to a very specific failure that had a very specific cause. And the cause had been identified in October by a man she had dismissed in about 30 seconds. The car ran. Systems clean. No shutdown. She thought about the kind of company she had built and whether it was actually the company she'd meant to build. She had said at every stage of Halcyon Velocity's development to investors, to employees, to the press in those profiles described her as a visionary, that the company's strength was its culture, its openness, its refusal to let hierarchy be an obstacle to good ideas. She had said those things and believed them and built systems designed to support them. And then a maintenance contractor had walked up to her in a corridor and told her the answer in plain language, and she had laughed at his boots. It was not, she thought, the behavior of someone who had built the company she was describing. It was the behavior of someone who had built a very compelling story about the company and confused the story for the thing itself. She stayed with that for a while. It was not comfortable. She didn't try to make it comfortable. When Derek came back, he came back alone. The others were still at lunch. He stood at the entrance to the bay and looked at the car for a moment before he looked at her. "Still running?" he asked. 2 hours and 9 minutes. He walked in and stood beside her. They watched the car together in the way that sometimes watch things they have complicated feelings about, not with joy exactly, not with simple relief, with the particular mix of emotions that happens when something you needed to be true turns out to be true in a way that also tells you something unflattering about yourself. "I should have tested it in October," Derek said. I laughed at him. I was dismissive. "I laughed," she said again, "in front of people. That's different from dismissive." Derek was quiet. "Who is he?" she asked. "Beyond the contractor badge. Do you know anything about him?" "Not much. His company's been doing our maintenance contract for about 8 months. I've seen him around the facility. He's quiet, does his work." Derek paused. "I think someone in facilities mentioned he has a kid. A young one. Single dad." Cassandra looked at the relay on the workbench. "I want to talk to him." She said, "I'll find out his schedule." I want to do it personally, not through Char, not through a formal process. I want to find him and talk to him myself. Derek nodded slowly. Kay, and Derek. She turned to look at him directly. The diagnostic failure, the fact that the secondary array wasn't in our high probability zone, I want a written analysis of how we missed it. For blame. For the process. So we know how to look for it next time. I've already started on it, he said. I started this morning. She nodded. That at least was something. It took her until the following afternoon to locate Noah Callahan's work schedule. He was in the facility on Thursdays and Fridays, primarily in the northern equipment zones and secondary buildings. On Thursdays, he typically finished around 4 and left quickly, someone in the facilities office told her, without quite understanding why she was asking, that he had a kid to pick up and he didn't mess around about it. She went looking for him at 3:45 on a Thursday. She found him behind the east warehouse, not in any of the rooms she'd checked first. He was kneeling beside an aging forklift, with his back to her, doing something to the hydraulic assembly with a wrench and what appeared to be focused, unhurried attention. He had his jacket on, because January in this part of the state was not concerned with the comfort of people working outside, and he was wearing the same kind of work boots she'd noticed in October. She had thought about what to say. She had drafted it in her head on the drive over, which she recognized as an instinct born of years of professional communication. Figure out the framework, identify the objective, structure the delivery. It was a useful instinct in most contexts. He let it go, Mr. Callahan. He turned. He didn't look surprised. Exactly. He looked like someone who had been concentrating on something else and needed a second to shift gears. When he registered who was standing there, something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Not hostility, not warmth. Caution, maybe. The caution of someone deciding how much to trust a situation before committing to it. He stood up. He was taller than she remembered. He had a smear of hydraulic fluid on his forearm that he apparently hadn't noticed. "It's Wren," he said. Fix the car, she said. Something shifted in his expression. "Your relay," she said. "The thermal relay. We tested it yesterday. 2 hours and 40 minutes of clean operation. No shutdown." She paused. "We're running extended tests through the weekend. But the thermal signature, the timing, the failure profile, it's exactly what you described." Looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the forklift, then back at her, as though he was making sure the conversation he was having was actually the one he thought he was having. "Okay," he said, "that's all you've got? Okay?" He stopped. Rubbed the back of his neck with the hand that didn't have the wrench in it. "I'm glad you found it. I'm glad the car's running. We spent $720,000, she said. After October. The number landed in the space between them. He said quietly, "The part cost $11.95. We had it in inventory." He didn't say "I told you so." He didn't rearrange his face into any expression that meant "I told you so" without saying it.
Yeah.
He just looked at her steadily, and she realized she had been partly braced for some version of that, some form of rightful scoring, even subtle, even politely packaged, and the absence of it was more disarming than the thing she'd been bracing for. "I came to apologize," she said. "Not for what the company did or didn't do with your information, for what I did specifically. In the corridor in October. The way I responded to you." "You laughed," he said, accusingly, just stating the fact. "Yes, in front of people." Was she stopped? Started again. "There's no version of that where I was doing anything other than dismissing you because of how you looked and what your job title was. I could construct some professional explanation about context and crisis management, but it wouldn't be honest." He looked at her for a while without speaking. She had the sense that he was deciding something, the same way she had the sense in the corridor that morning that he'd been deciding something when he turned and walked away from her. "I appreciate that," he said finally. "That's it? What else do you want me to say?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I thought you might be angry." "I was," he said for a while. He looked down at the wrench in his hand, turned it once, looked back up. "My daughter asked me if it made me mad." I told her a little. "She asked if I was going to stay mad." He paused. "I'm not a person who has a lot of energy to spend on things I can't change." Cassandra was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like she asks good questions," she said. Something shifted in his face, then not a full smile exactly, but close enough to the neighborhood of one. She asks about 40 questions an hour on average. Some of them are good. The winter air was cold and flat. The warehouse behind him had a corrugated metal wall that pinged slightly when the wind moved against it. Somewhere in the facility, a vehicle engine started up and then idled down. "I'd like to offer you a position," she said. He stilled. "Out of obligation," she said quickly. "Not because I feel like I owe you something, and this is the corporate resolution. I've been thinking about this since last night. You have a specific kind of knowledge that this company needs and that we currently don't have access to in any formal way. The ability to hear a machine and understand what it's telling you that's not in any of Derek's engineering reports. It's not something we can hire from a consultancy. You've got 9 years of it, and you've been doing contract maintenance work because that's where the market puts you, not because it's the ceiling of what you're capable of." He was watching her with that steady, careful tension. "Field reliability specialist," she said. "Direct access to the engineering team. Real involvement in the development process. It's not a title we've had before I'd be creating it for this role." A long pause. The wind moved against the corrugated wall again. He asked, "And I mean the real reason. I just gave you the real reason. You gave me the professional reason," he said. "I want to know why you specifically want to fix this." She thought about the hour she'd spent alone in the prototype bay, sitting with the car running in front of her. Thinking about the story she'd been telling herself about the kind of company she was building and the distance between that story and October 23rd. "Because I looked at your boots and your shirt and decided you didn't have anything worth hearing," she said. "And I run a company full of people who have ideas I'm probably not hearing right now for the exact same reason. And the Tempest R1 almost died because of it. Not because of the relay." She met his eyes. "Because of the laugh." Noah looked at the ground for a moment. When he looked back up, something in his face had changed, not softened, exactly. Clarified. "I've got a daughter I pick up at 3:30, he said. "Every day. That doesn't move. It doesn't have to. And I'll need to talk to the owner of my contracting company before I give you an answer. She's given me steady work, and she deserves the notice directly, not through a resignation letter. Course. And..." He stopped. He seemed to be measuring something. "Have a condition." "Okay, not for me," he said. "I'll take the role if you'll do something else. Create a way for the people who do the work I've been doing, the maintenance contractors, the floor workers, the people who fix things that break to actually get their ideas to someone who can act on them. A suggestion box. Something real. Something where if a guy in a work shirt figures out what's wrong with your car, he has a path to tell you that doesn't depend on whether you feel like listening that day." Cassandra looked at him. He held her gaze without any apparent self-consciousness about what he'd just asked for. "That's a fair condition," she said. "It's the only one I have." She put out her hand. He looked at it for a beat. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but long enough that she noticed it, and then he shook it. His grip was direct. There was still hydraulic fluid on his forearm. "I need to finish this forklift," he said. "And then I need to pick up my daughter. I'll have HR prepare a formal offer. You'll have it by Monday." She turned to go. She'd gotten about 10 feet when she heard him say her name. Or not her name, her title. Mun, she turned. He had gone back to his crouch beside the forklift, wrench in hand, like the conversation was already behind him, and the hydraulic assembly was what required his attention now. He glanced up at her. "The forklift's been making a grinding noise on the left rear wheel since Tuesday," he said. "The bearing's going. Somebody should log that before it fails completely." She looked at him. "I'll make sure it gets logged." He went back to the hydraulic assembly. She walked back through the warehouse loading area, through the facility's side corridor, past the break room with its permanent smell of burnt coffee, past the freight elevator he had fixed in 18 minutes in October. She walked all the way back to her office on the 4th floor and stood at the window that looked out over the empty winter courtyard, and she thought about a man kneeling beside a forklift in the January cold, telling her about a bearing that was going to fail, because she'd asked. Not because it was his job anymore, technically at that moment. Just because he'd noticed it. Because that was what he did. Because some people spent their lives listening to broken things, and after long enough, the listening became a reflex, automatic, unglamorous, and worth more than any title you could put on a badge. The Tempest R1 was still running in the bay below her. 2 hours and 40 minutes and counting on $11.95, and 9 years of someone paying attention to things that were easy to walk past. She looked at the courtyard for a long time. The bare tree at its center had a few small buds on the lower branches, hard to see from the 4th floor, easy to miss entirely. She'd walked past that tree 5 times a week for 3 years and had not previously noticed them. They were there regardless. The formal offer arrived in Noah's email on Monday morning at 42, which was earlier than he'd expected and more detailed than he'd prepared himself for. Yet he read it at the kitchen table while Maisie ate cereal across from him, her feet swinging because she was still too short to reach the floor from the kitchen chair, which she found annoying, and had mentioned approximately 300 times since her last birthday. She had her school library book propped against the cereal box, a book about marine animals that she had renewed twice already and showed no signs of returning voluntarily. Read the offer twice. Then he set his phone face down on the table and looked at his coffee. The salary was more than he'd made in any 2-year period of his adult life combined. It was not an exaggeration. He did the math in his head, which took about 4 seconds, and the result was the same both times. The benefits package was the kind that people who had never had to think carefully about whether a doctor's visit was worth the cost didn't fully appreciate as a benefit. It was the kind that people who had thought about it very carefully recognized immediately as something that changed the practical texture of daily life in ways that were hard to articulate, but impossible to overstate. He had a daughter with no backup health insurance who was 6 years old and had already broken her wrist, once falling off a playground structure, and who would, statistically and by her own personality, almost certainly break something else before she reached adulthood. He looked at the offer again. Dad, he looked up. Yes, he'd intervened. Maisie was watching him over the top of her marine animals book with an expression that suggested she had been watching him for a little while and had decided to say something about it. You keep making your thinking face. I'm thinking. What? He considered how to explain it. He'd told her in general terms about the job offer the same way he'd told her about the relay situation back in October, filtered down to something that made sense for a 6-year-old. A lady at the place where he worked wanted him to come work there for real, instead of just for a while. The lady was the boss of the whole company. Maisie had taken this in and asked whether the company made cars, and when he said yes, she asked if she could have one, and he said not yet, and she returned to her book. That had been Friday night. The job, he said now. Are you going to take it? I'm thinking about it. She put the book down. Maisie had a way of giving people her full attention that could be slightly unnerving in a child direct and patient, and completely absent of the fidgety distraction that most 6-year-olds deployed in conversation. You should take it, she said. Yeah? You fixed their car. That's not exactly. He stopped. It's more complicated than that. You told them what was wrong, and they didn't listen, and now they want you to work there. She picked up her spoon. That means you were right, and they know it. You should go. Looked at his daughter for a moment. When did you get so practical? He asked. She shrugged with one shoulder in a way that was unmistakably and somewhat unnervingly exactly the way he shrugged. Someone has to be. He called the owner of his contracting company. That morning, a woman named Deborah Shemansky, who had been running maintenance contracts in the region for 22 years and who had given Noah his first steady work after he left community college. She was 63, direct to the point of occasionally being startling, and had the gift of never making professional conversations more complicated than they needed to be. Halcyon Velocity, she said when he'd explained the offer. Cassandra Wren's company. You know it? I know the name. We've been doing their maintenance contract for 8 months. A pause. She offered you a full-time specialist position. Yes, and you're calling me first instead of just sending a resignation notice. You gave me steady work when I needed it, he said. You deserve to hear it directly. Deborah was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, still direct, but with something underneath it that might have been, on another person, close to warmth. Take the job. I wanted to take the job. Give me 3 weeks' notice so I can arrange coverage on the Halcyon contract. Lord knows they'll need decent on those northern equipment zones, and then take the job. You've been the best contractor on my roster since 2019, and you've been underpaid the entire time because that's how this industry works, and this is you getting something better. Call me asking permission." He exhaled. "I wasn't asking permission. You were a little." He conceded this silently. 3 weeks, she said. "And tell me one thing." "What?" "How'd you end up with a full-time offer from a billionaire CEO?" He thought about October 23rd. About the corridor and the laugh, and the $12 relay, and the note filed in a folder that sat unread for 3 months. He thought about a woman standing in a parking lot behind a warehouse in January, saying, "I looked at your boots and decided you didn't have anything worth hearing." "I told her what was wrong with her car," he said. Deborah was quiet for a beat, and she listened. "Eventually," he said. "Eventually counts," Deborah said. 3 weeks, Noah. Mess up the farewell. He called Cassandra Wren's office that afternoon and left a message with Priya that he was accepting the offer pending the 3-week transition. Priya said she'd pass it along. Cassandra called back herself 40 minutes later, which surprised him. 3 weeks' work, she said. "I'll have Derek start putting together an orientation. Existing framework for what the field reliability role looks like day to day. We'll be building that together as we go." I figured. "Is that okay?" "Yeah." He was in his truck in the parking lot of the grocery store, where he'd stopped on the way home for Maisie's cereal, which she ate at a rate that suggested she had some kind of separate, cereal-related metabolic system operating independently of the rest of her body. "I've been figuring things out as I go for a while. It's not the worst way to work." A brief pause. "I talked to Derek about the orientation framework. He wants to do a full walkthrough of the Tempest R1 systems documentation first, so you have the theoretical baseline before we put you in the room with the car." That sounds like Derek. Another pause, and then she said, "Is that a problem?" He considered. "It's the way engineers approach things. Give me the specs, then see whether the specs match what the equipment is actually doing." "Yeah, it makes sense." He shifted in his seat. "I'll tell you up front, I read schematics well enough to follow the conversation. But I'm not going to be the guy who catches a software architecture error. That's not where I'm useful. I know that. I'm useful when the machine is doing something the schematic says it shouldn't be doing. The real behavior and the design behavior are different, and nobody can figure out why." That's when he stopped, slightly self-conscious about explaining his own value to someone who had just offered to pay significantly for it. "That's the work I know." "That's exactly the work we need," Cassandra said. "Not in the way that people say things they want you to believe, but in the flat, direct way of someone stating something they've already thought through carefully. 3 weeks. I'll have Priya send the onboarding details." She hung up. He sat in the grocery store parking lot for another minute. Then he went in and got the cereal. The 3 weeks passed the way transition periods, passed quickly in retrospect, slowly while they were happening. Finished out his remaining assignments on the Halcyon contract, and handed his equipment logs to the contractor Dema to replace him. A steady, quiet man named Curtis, who Noah walked through the northern equipment zones personally, and who asked Guts Kid. On his last official day as a maintenance contractor, the freight elevator on the 3rd floor jammed again. He fixed it in 14 minutes, which was 4 minutes faster than October, and left a detailed note in the maintenance log about the relay housing that was going to need full replacement within 6 months. The note for Curtis, but left it the way he always left things thorough and specific, because whoever came after him would be working with the same equipment and deserved to know what he'd learned. His first day as a Halcyon Velocity employee fell on a Monday in the middle of February, which was cold and gray in the particular way that mid-February in this part of the country is cold and gray, which is without apology or variation, just a flat commitment to making you remember what warmth felt like. To facility in the truck. He drove to the facility in the truck, which he'd finally addressed the rear differential on during his last week of contracting, and which now ran with an absence of sound that felt almost suspicious. He wore his cleanest work clothes, not a suit, because nothing in the offer had suggested, and nothing about the role suggested one either, and he was not going to start a new job dressed as someone he wasn't. Clean dark shirt, good jeans, the boots because the boots were fine. Yet badged in through the main employee entrance instead of the contractor side door. It was a small difference that was not actually a small difference. Priya met him in the lobby and walked him through the employee orientation materials with the efficient warmth of someone who had done this many times and understood that new employees had a limited tolerance for paperwork before they needed to see the actual work. She got him through the essentials in 40 minutes and then walked him to the prototype bay, where Derek and Cassandra Chen were running extended diagnostics on the Tempest R1. The car was still running clean. 17 days of clean operation since the relay replacement. Shutdowns. No anomalous readings. The performance data had been compiled into a preliminary report that Derek had shared with the board, and Marcus Webbs had responded with something that people who knew Marcus described as the equivalent of a standing ovation, which was a single 2-sentence email that contained no criticism. Derek looked up when Noah and Priya came in. He set down his tablet and walked over, and there was a brief, slightly awkward moment where both of them were deciding how to handle the first formal interaction between a man who had dismissed the other's advice in October and the man whose advice had been dismissed. Derek resolved it by extending his hand and saying, simply, "Glad you're here." Shook it. "Thanks. I mean it," Derek said. "Not as a formality," Noah said. They stood for a moment looking at the Tempest R1. Then Derek started walking Noah through the systems documentation. And that was how. The first day began 2 people standing next to a car, talking about how it was supposed to work and how it had actually been working, and the gap between those 2 things, which was where the useful knowledge lived. Sandra Chen came over after about 20 minutes. She had a directness that Noah appreciated. She didn't do the careful, professional dance around the October situation. She just said, "You were right about the heat signature pattern. I've been going back through the earlier diagnostic logs, and the contact resistance data was in there. We read it wrong because we were looking at the primary array." She paused. "That bothers me." "Yeah," Noah said. "What did you hear?" Specifically, in October. He told her exactly what he'd heard: the click sequence, the floor vibration, the timing. She listened the ways engineers listen when they're genuinely collecting data, rather than waiting for their turn to speak. She asked 3 follow-up questions. Then she nodded and went back to her station. Later, Pete Garza introduced himself and said something about the October note that was more honest than Noah expected from someone who'd been in the doorway, with the smirk. "I didn't take it seriously when Derek told us about it. Was my mistake. I should have." He said it without self-flagellation, just stated it and moved on, which Noah respected. He said something equally direct back, and they went from there. He was home by 4:15, which gave him time to pick up Maisie and stop for gas before dinner. Cassandra came by the prototype bay on his second day to supervise, or at least not in the way that word usually implied she came in, looked at what Derek and Noah were doing, asked 1 or 2 questions, and then mostly listened. She had a way of being present in a technical conversation without taking it over that surprised him slightly, given what he knew about her by reputation. He'd read a few profiles of her, the kind that appeared in business publications and tended to feature phrases like relentless and visionary, and various architectural metaphors about building things from nothing. The person those profiles and the person standing next to the Tempest R1 were the same person, he thought. But the profiles had only captured the surface of the shape, not the actual texture. She was watching the thermal monitoring display when she said, without looking at him directly, "How's the first week?" "It's 2 days in." "How are the first 2 days?" "Different," he said. She glanced at him. "Good different?" He considered. "The work is the same, basically. Listening to the machine, figuring out what it's telling you. The room is fancier." He paused. "People ask me more questions now. That part's different. Is that okay?" Yeah, he looked at the display. "It's better, actually. In the old setup, nobody was asking me what I thought. I was just there to fix what broke. Here the point is to figure out why things break before they do." He stopped. "That's more interesting." She nodded and went back to looking at the display. He noticed that she didn't tell him. She was glad he thought so, or validate the observation in any of the ways that people in leadership positions sometimes overcorrect by doing with people they feel they owe something to. She just absorbed it and moved on, which he respected. The program was her idea, and she moved on it faster than he'd expected. She called it the Open Floor Initiative, which was a working title that the communications team later refined and that he privately thought was slightly too polished for what the thing actually was, which was simple: a direct channel for any employee at any level to submit operational observations and ideas to a small review panel that had the authority to act on them within 2 weeks. A committee, not a suggestion portal that went into a database and was reviewed quarterly. A real panel, 2 engineers, 1 operations specialist, and 1 senior leader, rotating quarterly, that read every submission and responded personally within 14 days. She announced it at an all-hands meeting in late February. The meeting was in the main facility common space, which fit most of the on-site staff with people standing at the edges. Stood near the back. He hadn't known she was going to mention the relay publicly, and he wasn't entirely prepared for it when she did. She didn't make it dramatic. She told it plainly. A maintenance contractor noticed something her engineering team had missed, brought it to her attention, and she dismissed it. Yes, he'd intervened, and the company spent 3 months and more than $700,000 afterward not solving a problem that had already been solved. She said it the way she'd said things to him in the parking lot behind the warehouse, which was without the softening language that people use when they're acknowledging failure in a way that doesn't fully acknowledge it. People looked at Noah. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up, because looking at the floor felt like it required something of other people that he hadn't asked for. A man near the front of the room, one of the assembly technicians, maybe 55, heavyset, with the permanent squint of someone who had spent years working in variable light, said, "So, what changed?" Cassandra looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what's different now? We've had suggestion boxes before. They never go anywhere." "The difference," Cassandra said, "is that now I know what it costs when they don't." The room was quiet. The technician nodded slowly, like he was testing the weight of that answer and finding it tentatively sufficient. "I'll believe it when I see it work," he said. "Fair enough," Cassandra said. "Come find me when you have something to say." After the meeting, 3 people came up to Noah in the common space. He hadn't expected that either. One of them was the assembly technician from the front of the room, who's turned out to be Walt. Walt shook his hand and said, without ceremony, "Good on you for not letting it go." Noah said he'd let it go for a while, actually. Walt said that was probably the smarter move in the short term. They agreed this was probably true and went their separate ways. The other 2 were younger, a floor technician, and an intern from the electrical team, and both of them, in slightly different ways, said versions of the same thing, that they'd noticed things before and hadn't known where to say it. One of them had a theory about a calibration issue in the battery charging protocol that he'd been sitting on for 4 months. He told Noah about it in a rapid, slightly nervous way, as though he'd been holding it back long enough that it came out faster than he intended. Told him to write it up and submit it through the new channel. "What if they don't take it seriously?" the young man asked. Looked at him. "Submit it anyway." Maisie met Cassandra in March, which happened accidentally, and was therefore probably the best possible way for it to happen. Had stayed late one evening to finish a cross-reference between the Tempest R1's updated thermal data and a comparative dataset Sandra had pulled from the secondary development unit, and he'd lost track of time in the way that you lose track of time when work is actually interesting you, which was a sensation he hadn't experienced frequently enough to have built reliable defenses against. He looked up at 4:58 and said something brief and sincere, and directed at nobody in particular. He called Renata, who did school pickup for him on the days he knew in advance he'd be late, but Renata was at her younger son's pediatric appointment and wasn't able to get there in time. The backup sitter he used had moved to another city 2 weeks ago. And the only other person he could call on short notice, who Maisie actually knew was, he stood in the prototype bay holding his phone and did the math, nobody immediately available. He explained the situation to Derek in 4 sentences and left. He made it to Birchwood Elementary at 3:52, was 22 minutes late, which was 22 minutes late, and which meant that Maisie was sitting on the front steps with her backpack and her marine animals book. She had finally returned it to the library and immediately checked out its sequel and the expression. "Traffic," she said. "Work," he said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stood up and took his hand and they walked to the truck. He had to go back to finish the cross-reference. He explained this to Maisie on the drive, who received it with the practical equanimity she brought to most logistical inconveniences. She could come and sit quietly and read her book. She had done this before, on the rare occasions when the contractor workday ran long and school pickup logistics required improvisation. She knew how to be still and unobtrusive in a work environment. She was, in fact, better at it than many adults Noah had met. He signed her in at the facility's visitor desk, under a policy that had existed but rarely been used. Family members of employees could be present in designated non-hazardous areas, and brought her to the small side room adjacent to the prototype bay where he'd been working with the thermal data. She sat in the corner chair with her book and her backpack and was quiet. He went back to the cross-reference. Cassandra came in 40 efferents. Cassandra key minutes later, with a question about the comparative data set that could not wait for morning, because Cassandra's questions rarely waited for morning. She stopped in the doorway when she saw Maisie. Maisie looked up from her book. A brief pause. "Hi," said Maisie. Cassandra looked at Noah, who was already doing the mental preparation required for explaining the situation to his employer. "My regular pickup fell through," he said. "She's fine, she's quiet. I'll finish the cross-reference and take her home by 7. "I'm quiet," Maisie confirmed, somewhat loudly. Cassandra looked at her for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not the professional face, not the CEO face, something underneath those. She walked over to the corner chair and crouched down to Maisie's level, which she did without apparent self-consciousness about what crouching down in a charcoal blazer looked like. "What are you reading?" she asked. Maisie showed her the cover. "Ocean Animals. This one is about deep-sea things. There's a fish that makes its own light." "An anglerfish?" Maisie's eyes went slightly wide. "You know about them?" "They're terrifying," Cassandra said. Maisie turned the book toward her and showed her the illustration. Cassandra looked at it with what appeared to be genuine interest, rather than performed adult interest, which children at 6 can distinguish from each other reliably. And Maisie identified this and responded by turning 3 more pages and showing her 3 more things she found notable about deep-sea biology, in a rapid, non-sequential way that was her natural method for sharing information she cared about. Cassandra listened to all of it. Noah had gone still at the desk, watching this. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Not that, exactly. After a few minutes, Cassandra stood up and looked at Noah. "The cross-reference question can wait," she said. "Finish it in the morning. I'm close to done. No, take your daughter home, Noah." He looked at her. "The thermal data will be here tomorrow," she said. "It's not going anywhere." She glanced back at Maisie. "It was nice to meet you." "You too," Maisie said. "Did you laugh at my dad?" The room became very still. Cassandra absorbed this for a moment. Noah opened his mouth. "Yes," Cassandra said, before he could say anything. "I did, and I was wrong to." Maisie considered this with the seriousness she applied to things she was working through. "Did you apologize?" "I did." "Okay," Maisie said, and went back to her book. Cassandra looked at Noah, particular expression, ready for the situation, because he had not previously been in this situation. Something in her face was doing something complicated. She pressed her mouth together briefly, nodded once, and left the room. Packed up the thermal data and took Maisie home. In the car she said, "She's tall, yeah." She was nice about the anglerfish. She was. Maisie looked out the window for a while. "I think she meant the apology," she said. "She looked like she meant it." "Drove," he said. "I think she did too." March moved into April, and the Tempest R1 moved from extended testing into the final pre-production phase, which meant the prototype bay took on a different energy, more purposeful, less anxious. The quality of the silence in that room changed. It had been for 6 months the silence of a problem without a solution. Was the silence people working towards something they believed in. His role evolved in ways that were hard to describe in an org chart, but felt correct in practice. He attended engineering reviews, where his function was partly technical and partly translational. He could hear what the car was doing and describe it in terms the engineering team could act on, which was a different kind of useful from what Sandra or Derek or Bryce provided, but fitted together with what they provided in a way that gradually stopped feeling provisional. Derek stopped prefacing Noah's input with softening language. Sandra started texting him directly when she had a question about an anomalous sound reading, rather than sending it through the formal feedback channel. Pete Garza, for his part, had quietly become something close to an ally. He had a habit of bringing coffee to the workbench on mornings when he knew they'd be doing long test runs, and he never made a performance out of it. Just set a cup where Noah could reach it and moved on. It was the kind of gesture that accumulated into a kind of respect that neither of them felt the need to name. The Open Floor Initiative received 47 submissions in its first 6 weeks. The review panel acted on 11 of them. 3 of those 11 generated changes in procedure or design that were subsequently incorporated into the Tempest R1's final production specifications. One of them came from Walt, the assembly technician who had said he'd believe it when he saw it work. His submission was about a recurring calibration drift in the battery charging interface that he'd been observing for months without a formal channel to report it. The panel reviewed it in 9 days. The fix took a week. Walt did not make a production of it. Saw him in the break room one afternoon, and Walt looked at him with an expression that communicated something that neither of them translated into words. And they went back to their respective work, and Cassandra and Noah's interactions during those months were mostly professional, which was the appropriate description of what they were, and also slightly incomplete. They had the working relationship, the prototype bay discussions, the engineering reviews, the occasional direct conversations about a technical question or a personnel issue. But around the edges of those things, in the small spaces between the formal interactions, something else was accumulating in the way that things accumulate when 2 people are repeatedly in the same rooms over time. He noticed things about her that the profiles had not included. That she brought her own lunch 4 days out of 5 and ate it standing at the window of her office, which he happened to observe from the courtyard below on the days he took his break outside. That she remembered, without being prompted, that Maisie had been reading the Ocean Animals book and asked one afternoon whether she had gotten to the bioluminescence chapter yet, which he had to look up later because he wasn't sure what bioluminescence meant and wasn't going to admit that in the moment. That she had a habit, the tap-it, when she was thinking hard about something, of touching the side of her jaw with 2 fingers very still, which he'd first noticed in October through the loading corridor window and had clocked again since. That she was trying. Not performing trying, actually doing it. The way she showed up at the Open Floor Initiative review panel meetings, which she wasn't required to attend, and listened to every item on the agenda without shortcutting the process. The way she told the board, in March's report, exactly where the $720,000 figure had gone, and what it had purchased, and what had actually solved the problem, without softening any of the numbers. Marcus Webb had sent her a private message after that report that Priya told Noah in one of those small confidences that happen between people who occupy adjacent spaces in an organization, had been terse and pointed. She had not changed the report. She had left the numbers exactly where they were. She was imperfect in ways that were still visible. She moved fast through conversations, and sometimes clipped the end of what someone was saying before they'd quite finished saying it. She could be terse in a way that was efficient, but occasionally landed harder than she intended. She had a reflex when she was under board pressure to project more certainty than she actually had, which was an understandable habit for someone in her position, and which Noah suspected she was working on. He was imperfect, too. He had a tendency close up when things felt uncertain, to retreat into the work and let the space around the work go unmanaged. He was still figuring out how to be a person who had a stake in things beyond his daughter and his tools. It was harder than it sounded. They were, both of them, people who had made serious mistakes and were deciding what to do about them. It was more of a foundation than it might appear. In April, she stopped by the side room one afternoon when he was reviewing Sandra's latest thermal data and said, not quite casually, "How's Maisie?" He looked up. She finished the deep sea book. She's moved on to birds. Cassandra looked faintly surprised. Birds? The transition made no sense to me either. She said birds are also weird, and people don't appreciate it enough. He paused. She's not wrong. Something in Cassandra's expression did the thing it had done in March, in the corner, with the anglerfish book, some quality that was not the professional face, something underneath it, present and unguarded. She sounds like a lot, Cassandra said. She's everything, Noah said. Simply and without drama, because it was simply and without drama the truth. Cassandra looked at the thermal data on his screen for a moment, then at the door, then back at him. There's a good diner on Route 9, she said. About 4 miles from here. Saturday mornings they do pancakes. She stopped. I've driven past it 100 times. I've never stopped. Noah looked at her. Maisie probably has opinions about pancakes, she said. Maisie has strong opinions about everything. So that's a yes? He thought about Renata telling him he didn't talk to people enough. He thought about the 3 in the morning question about dignity versus stubbornness and whether there was a meaningful difference. He thought about a woman crouching down in a charcoal blazer to look at pictures of anglerfish, saying, yes, I laughed at him, and I was wrong. Saturday, he said. Saturday. She left. He looked at the thermal data for another moment without seeing it. Then he picked up his phone and texted Maisie. She had a phone now, a basic one he'd gotten her for school communication purposes, which she used exclusively for communication with him and for looking up facts about birds at inconvenient times. He typed, "Do you want pancakes on Saturday?" The reply came in 40 seconds. Yes. Are they from the good place or the regular place? Typed, new place. A pause. Then, okay, I'll give it a chance. He set down the phone and went back to the thermal data, and the prototype bay hummed quietly around him. And somewhere in the facility, the Tempest R1 was running clean and steady, doing exactly what it had been built to do, and a $12 relay was sitting in exactly the right position. And the day outside the window was moving into the particular golden gray of a late afternoon in early spring, which was not a perfect thing, but was, undeniably, a good one. The diner on Route 9 was called Patsy's, and it had been there since 1987, which you could tell from the laminated menus and the particular shade of yellow on the walls that had probably been cheerful once and had since aged into something more accurately described as committed. The booths had red vinyl seats that made a sound when you sat down that Maisie found extremely funny and tested 3 times before Noah put a hand on her shoulder. Okay, he said. It's funny, she said. I know. Okay. Cassandra was already there when they arrived, sitting in the corner booth with a coffee she'd apparently ordered the moment she sat down, because Cassandra Wren did not sit in booths without something to do with her hands. She was in jeans and a gray sweater, which was the least formal Noah had seen her, and it changed something subtle about the geometry of her face. She looked younger, or maybe just less armored, which was not quite the same thing. She looked up when they came in. She smiled at Maisie first, which Noah noticed and filed away in the category of things he noticed without deciding what to do with yet. Maisie slid into the booth across from her and picked up the menu with the authority of someone who had opinions about breakfast and intended to exercise them. They have blueberry, Maisie said. I saw that, Cassandra said. Blueberry is the best indicator of whether a pancake place is serious. Cassandra looked at Noah over the top of Maisie's menu. He gave her the small shrug that meant this is how she is, and sat down. Why blueberry? Cassandra asked. Maisie set the menu down and explained, with the focused gravity of someone presenting findings, blueberry pancakes required more skill because the berries released water when they cooked, and a bad kitchen would end up with a soggy pancake, whereas a good kitchen knew how to manage the moisture, and you got a pancake that was cooked through properly, with blueberries that were still intact and not burst into purple puddles. Yes, she had learned this from a cooking show she watched with Renata. Cassandra listened to this without any of the performed interest that adults sometimes offered children, and when Maisie finished, she said, "That's actually a good test." Maisie said and went back to the menu. Noah ordered coffee. The waitress, a woman in her 60s, with the energy of someone who had seen every possible combination of people walk through that door and had decided decades ago to simply get on with it, took their orders without ceremony and moved on. It was, all things considered, not a difficult morning. That surprised him slightly. Yet he'd intervened. He had expected some version of awkward the first meal that wasn't a working meeting, the first time the 3 of them were in a room together without a thermal cassette or a dead forklift providing structural support for the interaction. Maisie was constitutionally incapable of allowing a social situation to become awkward, not because she was skilled at small talk, but because she had no concept of it. She talked about what she was thinking about, which was currently birds, specifically the bar-tailed godwit, which she informed them could fly 11,000 kilometers without stopping. 11,000, she said, for emphasis. That's farther than I've ever flown, Cassandra said. Do you fly a lot for work? Not 11,000 at once. Maisie considered this. Do you like it? Flying? Working. The car company. Cassandra wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Watched her think about how to answer, which she did actually. She didn't reach for the automatic. Yes, the professional enthusiasm. She actually thought about it. I like building things, she said finally. The company is a way to build things. Sometimes I like the company part more than other times. Maisie nodded, as though this was a reasonable answer. Dad likes fixing things, she said. He says it's the same. It's similar, Noah said. He says when something's broken and then it works, it's like. Maisie frowned, trying to remember the exact phrasing. It's like the thing is telling you thank you. Cassandra looked at him. He picked up his coffee. I said something like that. She's paraphrasing. That's a good way to put it, Cassandra said. The pancakes came. Maisie examined hers with the focus of someone conducting a formal assessment, then cut into them and ate a deliberate first bite and chewed carefully. Good blueberry, she said. The kitchen is serious. They ate. The diner had the pleasant low noise of a Saturday morning crowd, other families, older couples, a group of men who looked like they'd come from an early sports practice of some kind. He'd intervened. It was the kind of place that existed in the background of other people's lives, and was the main event of nobody's in particular, which gave it a comfortable anonymity. At some point, Maisie got up to look at the small display case near the register that had local baked goods in it, and Noah and Cassandra were briefly alone in the booth, and neither of them rushed to fill the silence with something professional. She's something, Cassandra said. Yeah, she looks like you. People say that. She has her mother's eyes. He watched Maisie press her nose toward the display case glass. Everything else, I guess. A pause. Is she? Cassandra stopped. I don't want to ask something I shouldn't. You can ask. Is she okay? With it being just you. He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. She's never known anything else. I think she's okay. I think she has things she doesn't say because she doesn't want to worry me. And I think that's a 6-year-old trying to protect her parent, which is backwards, and I try to stay aware of it. He looked at his coffee. She asked me once why her mom didn't stay. I told her I didn't have a good answer. She said that was okay, that sometimes things just go the way they go. He paused. I don't know if she believed it, or if she just decided it was what she needed to say. Cassandra was quiet. She's tougher than she should have to be, he said. But I think she's okay. Maisie came back with the snickerdoodle she'd been allowed to purchase, with the $2 she kept folded in the small zippered pocket of her jacket. She sat down and broke it into precise halves, and offered one to Cassandra without being asked, which was Noah registered this without comment, the highest form of approval available in Maisie's social currency. Cassandra took the half. Maisie ate the other half and went back to thinking about the bar-tailed godwit. The Tempest R1 launched on the 14th of May, which was a Thursday, which was not the day anyone would have chosen if they were optimizing for symbolic resonance, but which was when the production timeline, the marketing schedule, logistics of a simultaneous multi-city press event all intersected, was there. That was a sentence that still felt faintly improbable when he thought it directly. The launch event was held at the main facility, which had been transformed for the occasion in ways that suggested a significant budget allocation toward making an industrial building look like the future. Media, investors, automotive journalists, a handful of people from the design and engineering community whose names Noah didn't recognize, but whose presence appeared to register with Derek as significant. Cameras, lighting, rigs. The kind of carefully managed atmosphere that communicated importance without saying it out loud. Cassandra spoke for 12 minutes. Noah watched from the side of the room, near the engineering team, in the good dark shirt he'd worn on his first day. He'd thought about a different shirt. He'd decided on the same one. She was composed in front of a crowd in the way that people are composed, when they've done it enough times that the performance has become a second language, fluent, technically correct, occasionally missing something that only native speakers would notice. But at a certain point in the 12 minutes, she went off script. He could tell because she looked down briefly at the notes she hadn't been looking at, and then looked back up and away from them. "This car almost didn't make it," she said. "I want to be honest about that, in a way that reads as humility theater, because I think you can tell the difference. The Tempest R1 had a failure that we could not isolate for 6 months, and we spent a significant amount of money and time looking in the wrong direction. The reason we were looking in the wrong direction, that the right direction was offered to us early, and we didn't take it seriously because of where it came from." She paused. A maintenance contractor, who had spent 9 years listening to industrial equipment, heard something that our science diagnostic systems didn't catch, and he told us, and we laughed at him. The room was quiet. "He was right," she said. "We were wrong. The company survived because we eventually were willing to admit that, and because he was willing to walk back into a building where that happened and try to help us anyway. I want to acknowledge that publicly, because it's the part of the story that matters most to me." She looked toward the engineering team section of the room, toward Noah. "His name is Noah Callahan. He's our field reliability specialist, and he's the reasons this car is standing in this room today." People looked at him. He had not expected that. She had not told him she was going to do that. He stood very still with his arms at his sides, and he did not look at the floor because he'd decided in the moment that looking at the floor was the wrong choice, and he looked instead at the car, at the Tempest in the center of the room, intervened, under the lights, looking like everything it had promised to be, and he let the attention pass over him without fighting it or performing anything in response to it. Someone started clapping. Not a polite, procedural round of applause. An actual one, the kind that builds because it's genuine. Yes, he looked at Cassandra across the room. She looked back at him with an expression that was not triumphant or congratulatory, or any of the things that the moment might have invited. It was something quieter than that. Something that looked, from where he was standing, like relief, not the relief of a crisis resolved, but the relief of a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down in the right place. He nodded once. She nodded back. Then she turned back to the room and finished the 12 minutes. The sales numbers came in over the following weeks, and they were better than the projections that the board had built in its most optimistic scenario. The pre-order list, which had shed 9 entries during the worst months of the failure period, had recovered and then exceeded its pre-crisis length. Automotive press coverage was strong in ways that mattered, not the breathless superlative coverage that faded quickly, but the substantive, technically engaged kind that signaled to the industry that something real had been built. Marcus sent Cassandra a 2-sentence email that Priya described, again as the equivalent of a standing ovation. This time there were 3 sentences. At the board review in June, Cassandra presented the Open Floor Initiative data. 47 initial submissions, 11 actioned, 3 incorporated into production specifications. 1 Walt's battery calibration observation had caught a drift pattern that, left unaddressed, would likely have produced field failures within the first production year. The board approved a formal budget allocation for the program's expansion. Elaine Forsyth, who had a gift for stating obvious things as though they were newly discovered, said the data suggested the program was generating measurable return on the investment of employee trust. Cassandra said yes. That was the point. She didn't say it with satisfaction. She said it with the flatness of someone for whom it had become simply true, the way things become simply true after you've lived with them long enough that the argument is over. Walt came to Noah's workstation in July with a printed copy of the production note that had been generated from his battery calibration submission. He put it on the desk without ceremony. "They cited me," Walt said. "Said they cited you." Walt looked at the note for a moment. He was 61 years old and had worked in manufacturing facilities since he was 22, and he had the look of someone for whom institutional recognition had been, for a long time, a category of experience that applied to other people. Picked up the printed note and folded it twice and put it in his shirt pocket, he said. Then he went back to the assembly floor, watched him go and thought about what it cost, not financially, not institutionally, but personally, in the daily currency of dignity, to spend years knowing things that nobody was asking you. to walk into a building and do skilled work and carry knowledge that had nowhere to go because the building's architecture had no door for it. He knew what that cost because he'd paid it, in a specific and public way, in October. Walt had been paying a quieter version of it for decades. The submission channel cost halcyon velocity, a panel of 4 people and 2 weeks of review time per submission cycle. The return on that investment was not easily quantifiable, which was exactly the kind of thing that made it difficult to protect in a budget conversation, and exactly the kind of thing that determined whether a company was actually what it claimed to be or just told a good story about it. He thought about the gap between those two things. He thought about how easy it was to build a compelling narrative and how hard it was to build the thing the narrative described. Particular insight into why some people did the hard version and others didn't. He just knew that the difference was real and that you could feel it. The way you could feel the difference between a building that was structurally sound and one that looked structurally sound, if you knew how to listen. He knew how to listen. Summer in Ranford was humid and unhurried in a way that felt earned after the length of the preceding winter. Yes, he'd intervened. Maisie finished first grade and came home on the last day with a folder of the year's work that she spread across the kitchen table and narrated for 45 minutes. Her teacher had written on her report card, in the comments section, that Maisie was intellectually curious, asked excellent questions, and had shown particular leadership in group activities, that leadership occasionally required some calibration regarding other students' need for independent work time. Read this twice, the same way he'd read Cassandra's job offer. Miss Patterson says I'm a leader, Maisie said. She also says you take over sometimes. Leaders lead. They also listen, he said. Maisie considered this with the particular expression she wore when she was deciding whether to accept a point or continue arguing it. She accepted it. She was getting better at that. He was choosing to believe it was partly his influence and partly just who she was becoming. Cassandra came to the house for the first time in July. It was not a significant occasion. Maisie had been telling her about Gerald the oak tree for 3 months with a persistence that eventually made a visit feel logistically inevitable, but it was the first time which gave it its own quiet weight. She came on a Saturday afternoon. She stood in the backyard with a glass of iced tea Noah had made from a powder mix because he'd forgotten to buy real tea, and she looked at Gerald with a seriousness that Maisie found entirely appropriate. He's bigger than I thought, Cassandra said. He's been there since before we moved in, Maisie said. I named him in the fall. He was upset about the leaves falling. Trees don't have feelings, Noah said. Maisie looked at him with the patience of someone who had explained this before. Know that for sure. Cassandra looked at the tree. It was a good tree, old, wide-armed, the kind that had survived a few storms, and had the slightly asymmetric posture that came from growing around obstacles over decades. I like him, Cassandra said. Maisie appeared satisfied. They sat on the sack steps afterward, the three of them, while Maisie conducted an investigation of something she'd found near the fence line that turned out to be a beetle of some kind, which she examined for 10 minutes and then carefully relocated to the base of Gerald on the grounds that beetles probably preferred trees. The afternoon was warm and still, and the neighborhood had the lazy Saturday quality of a place where people were mostly indoors in the air conditioning, or in backyards like this one, not doing anything in particular. Cassandra had her iced tea. She was not looking at her phone, which was unusual enough that Noah had noticed it. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah. When you walked away in October, after I laughed. She held the glass in both hands. What were you thinking? He thought about it. He tried to remember the actual texture of it, not the cleaned-up version. That I'd wasted my time, he said, and that I should have known better than to try. And then I went and picked up Maisie and made pasta and helped her with a worksheet about telling time. He paused. And then at some point I thought I don't have the energy to be angry at people for being wrong about me. I've got enough to do. Cassandra was quiet for a moment. I think about October more than is probably useful, she said. With guilt, exactly. More like I use it as a calibration. When I'm in a conversation with someone, and I feel that reflex, the one that wants to dismiss something because of where it's coming from rather than what it actually says. I catch it now. I don't always succeed, but I catch it more. That's probably worth more than the guilt, he said. I think so too. She looked at Maisie, who was now delivering a careful monologue to the beetle before releasing it. I've been thinking about what you said. On that first day. The work is the same building and fixing. Yeah. I think the harder part is the same too, she said, when something's broken. Being willing to name it. He looked at her. She was looking at Maisie, so he had a moment to look at her directly, without the slight sideways quality their interactions usually had. She looked tired in the way that people who carry significant weight look tired, not depleted, but aware of the weight at all times, even in moments of rest. You're doing okay, he said. She glanced at him. At what specifically? At the hard part. She looked at him for a moment. He looked he'd intervened. Then she returned to the steps and was explaining the beetle situation in detail. Cassandra listened to the explanation. She asked 2 questions. Maisie answered them with the full gravity of a scientist reporting results. It was nothing, really. It was a Saturday afternoon in a backyard in Ranford with iced tea from a powder mix and a 6-year-old explaining beetle behavior to a billionaire CEO, and Gerald the oak tree standing in the corner being patient about the whole thing. It was not a perfect afternoon. It was better than that. It was real. Inside the Halcyon Velocity facility, behind a small panel of glass in a display case mounted on the wall between the main entrance and the corridor that led to the prototype bay, there was a relay. It was small, smaller than you expected looking at it. A standard thermal contact relay, the kind that appeared in maintenance parts inventories, without much ceremony. The label below it read only the date it had been installed and the date it had been replaced, and a cost figure, 11.95. Additional explanation. Employees passed it every day. Some of them knew the story. Some of them had been there in October and in the months after, and they knew what the case represented, without needing to read an explanation. Others were newer engineers brought in for the production phase, administrative staff hired when the launch success warranted expanded headcount, and they sometimes stopped and looked at it and asked someone nearby what it was. The answer they got depended on who they asked, because different people carried different pieces of the story. Some told it as an engineering lesson, the importance of thermal load testing in secondary assemblies, the danger of diagnostic tunnel vision. Some told it as a leadership lesson, the cost of hierarchical thinking in a problem-solving environment. If you asked Walt, told it as a workers' rights story, which was not inaccurate. The few times he was asked directly, told it simply. A car was broken. Someone noticed why. It took a while for anyone to listen. Eventually someone did. That was the whole story, he said. The rest was just details. The people who heard it that way, stripped down to its frame, sometimes pressed him for more. Didn't it make you angry? Didn't you want to prove a point? Wasn't there a moment where you wanted to watch them fail? He thought about Maisie at the kitchen table, asking whether he was going to stay mad. He thought about what it actually cost, not emotionally but practically, to carry anger at something you couldn't change. He thought about how much he could not afford in those months financially, logistically, in every material sense to spend energy on anything that didn't directly serve getting Maisie to school and keeping the lights on. I had a daughter to pick up every afternoon, he said. At 3:30, you figure out pretty quickly what's worth your time. People laughed at that usually. It was funny. It was also true, which was the only kind of funny worth bothering with. In September, Maisie turned 7. The party was in the backyard, which was the only reasonable location, because Maisie had declared at some point during the summer that Gerald should be present at her birthday. And Gerald was not relocatable. 6 kids from her class, Renata's family, and Cassandra, who arrived with a wrapped gift and the slightly uncertain posture of someone who had attended very few children's birthday parties in recent years and was not confident about the protocols. Maisie solved this immediately by assigning her the job of holding the banner, while Noah tied it to Gerald's lower branch, which gave Cassandra something specific to do and a position of structural importance, which she appeared to find genuinely stabilizing. The cake was chocolate. This was non-negotiable. Maisie had specified chocolate in February, and the specification had not changed in 7 months, and Noah had not been surprised. At some point in the afternoon, while the which were running around the yard in a game that had started as tag, and evolved into something more complex that none of the adults could follow. Renata sat down next to Cassandra at the folding table and said, without preamble, because Renata was not a person who used preamble, "You work with my brother." "I do," Cassandra said. "He talks about the job now," Renata said. "He didn't used to talk about work. He'd come home and it was done and he'd think about Maisie and that was it." "Yep." She looked at her. "He talks about what he's working on." Sandra said this. Derek found that. The panel actioned a submission from this guy Walt. Renata paused. "It's good. I'm just telling you." Cassandra was quiet for a moment. "He's good at what he does." "I know that," Renata said. "I've known that for years. Nice that somebody else does too." She went to referee whatever the tag game had become, and Cassandra sat for a moment with her cup of birthday party lemonade, watching Noah on the other side of the yard, helping a kid who had scraped her knee on the fence, kneeling down and assessing the damage with calm, practical attention, and then guiding her toward Renata for the Band-Aid logistics. He did it the same way he did everything, without drama, without making the moment bigger than it needed to be, just seeing what needed doing and doing it. She thought about October. She thought about the corridor, and the laugh, and the note she'd found in the folder at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. And she thought about the distance between who she'd been in that moment and what she was trying to be now, and the distance was not nothing, and also not everything. You didn't fix that kind of thing in one gesture. Not with an apology, not with a job offer, not with a program or a display case or a 3-sentence acknowledgement at a product launch. You fixed it, slowly, incrementally, by doing the thing differently the next time, and the time after that, by catching the reflex before it became an action, by building structures that didn't depend on you personally remembering to be humble on a given day. You built the channel. You staffed the panel. You put the relay behind glass, not as a monument to yourself, but as a question you kept asking, are you listening to the right people? Sometimes yes, sometimes still no. You kept asking. Maisie ran over and grabbed Cassandra's arm because the game needed another player on the side who were not the chasers, and the team was short and she had been nominated. "I don't know the rules," Cassandra said. "There aren't really rules," Maisie said. "You just have to run." Cassandra looked at her. She looked across the yard at Noah, who was watching this with the expression of a person observing something he hadn't predicted and was still deciding what to call it. The afternoon was warm, and the oak tree Gerald was in full late summer leaf, and the birthday party had the slightly chaotic, genuinely happy quality of a thing that had not been planned to perfection and was better for it. She stood up, she ran. She was not good at the game. She got tagged inside the first 90 seconds and then was a chaser herself, which meant she was the thing being avoided by 6-7-year-olds who were significantly faster than her, and she ran after them with a total absence of dignity and was spectacularly unsuccessful. Maisie thought this was hilarious. Watched from the edge of the yard with his arms folded, and a look on his face that he would not have been able to name exactly if someone had asked him, but which was something in the neighborhood of, "Here is my life. Strange and imperfect and unplanned, and I would not trade any part of it. Not the relay, not October, not the 3:30 pickup every day, not the leaking faucet or the oak tree or the powder mix iced tea or any of it. He would not trade any of it. Some lessons cost $12. Some cost $700,000. The expensive ones, in his experience, were not always the ones that came with the larger number. Sometimes the most expensive thing is the laugh in the hallway, the one that costs you 3 months, and your dignity and your certainty. Deposits in return something you didn't expect to find in a company hallway, or a backyard birthday party, or a diner that made serious pancakes on Route 9. Something that looked, if you were paying attention, a lot like the rest of your life.